and welcome to the University of Chicago's Alumni Association Career Month webinar series. My name is Rachel Burkhan-Rommelfinger, and I work with the Alumni Career Development team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our final Career Month webinar entitled Top 7 Lessons on Empathy for the Executive Leader. Today's speaker is three-time alum, Lou Augusta, who, when I asked him for an interesting fact about his life, he shared that when he was a boy, his father brought the original VW Bug as their family car. And then he wrote a prize-winning essay about it for his 5th grade class, highlighting the fact that the gas tank was under the front hood, so that the gas station attendant couldn't figure out where to put the gas. It's my pleasure to hand the controls over to Lou for our presentation today.
Rachel, thank you for that very warm and empathic introduction and a welcome to one and all to our session on top 7 empathy lessons for executive leadership. I acknowledge your empathy. It is in the nature of this presentation that I'm going to be doing most of the talking. We will have Q&A, and I'm eager also to hear your contribution, your questions and issues. But at least until that point, I acknowledge that the empathy that we make present in this talk lives in your listening. So I thank you for that. I'm honored to be here. My thanks to the U of Chicago Alumni Organization and to the great folks over there for expanding empathy in the individual and in the community. We're going to, here is our agenda today. For those of you who are on replay or may not have the written thing in front of you, we're going to define our terms, especially empathy. We're going to look at the top 7 lessons for leadership. We're going to actually have, amazingly enough, a 1-minute empathy training. You can be trained for empathy in 1 minute. Now, the devil is in the detail, and it takes a lot of practice. The practice takes more than 1 minute. And then we're going to have time for questions and issues, and to mix it up, your comments are very welcome. We're going to start off with a poll. You should see the polling question number 1. How do you define empathy? How to define empathy? Being compassionate towards the other person, is that empathy? Experiencing the other person's experience vicariously? Giving the other person agreement, authentic agreement, taking a walk in the other person's shoes, translating the other person's experience into one's own. So there's no penalty for guessing. Give it your best shot, see what comes up. People are making up their mind. People are thinking about it. And we have the results of the poll. Being compassionate weighs in at 14%. Experiencing the other person vicariously weighs in at 23%. 2% go with giving the other person agreement. Taking a walk in the other person's shoes, 44%, and translating the other's experience into one's own as 16%. So the majority of people go with the folk definition of empathy. That's in effect the folk definition of empathy, taking a walk in the other person's shoes. If you answered translating the other person's experience into one's own, you would not be wrong. It's a trick question, and there's more than one correct answer. Translating the other person's experience into one's own and then sharing it with the other person is a kind of empathic responsiveness. Taking a walk in the other person's shoes is, I would say, empathic interpretation. I interpret my experience in terms of what the other person's experience is and the other person's experience in terms of my own. Giving the other person agreement, most people say, well, you know, I mean, nothing wrong with agreement, but agreement is not empathy. Yes, that's right. Experiencing the other person's experience vicarious is phase 1 of empathy. So if you answered having a vicarious experience is an aspect of empathy, indeed it is. When we did other survey work, this survey work was already over a year old, but when we went actually out, I sent people out and asked people, in effect, the person on the street, what do you think empathy is? What do you think empathy was? A majority of people in that poll gave an example of acting compassionately, of acting altruistically, of acting charitably, of helping somebody out who was in a jam and needed help. So it's interesting. I would say, ladies and gentlemen, the world needs both more empathy and more compassion, and they are different, distinct things, different, distinct phenomena. Empathy is not compassion. Compassion is not empathy. We're going to talk more about that by looking at what actually, so, you're talking, Lou, what's the definition? What's your definition of empathy? And here's my working definition of empathy. There are four aspects of empathy. Right up front, I have empathic receptivity. That's the vicarious experience dimension. Be open to the experience of the other person. Is the other person experiencing fear, anger, sadness, high spirits, really happy? We human beings, and indeed we mammals, are all related physiologically. It is a myth that we are unrelated. It's a bit of a trend to dump on Rene Descartes, who closed himself up in a warm room and disconnected himself from the world. But the myth is that we're unrelated. The reality is that all human beings, and indeed higher mammals, we vibrate together. Now, that's not full-blown adult developed phase 4 empathy. That's entry level empathy. We communicate experiences between one another vicariously. So phase 1 of empathy, be open. Be open to the possibility that you're experiencing a vicarious experience. And that's what happens in the theater, in the movies. We go to the show to get a vicarious experience of fear, of danger, what's happening to the protagonist, the antagonist. And, I do so like a happy ending, but sometimes a sad ending can be cathartic too. People go away with great satisfaction. So phase 1, now take that vicarious experience and process it further. Who is the other person as a possibility? What's the other person as a possibility that they would be having this experience in this situation, in these circumstances? Now, if I get stuck at this point, then invoke the folk definition of empathy. Take a walk in the other person's shoes. What's the view from over there? And the trick here is not to project myself into their situation. You see, that's both the challenge and the devil in the detail. I need to have some aspect, some understanding, some engagement with who the other person is as a possibility in order to really take a walk and understand where the shoe pinches the other person. That's the challenge. I know where my shoe pinches, but I don't necessarily know where the other guy's shoe pinches, right? I mean, that's the challenge there. Now, we're all human beings. We share many things in common, but we also share, so to speak, in a mode, a kind of privative mode. We also have differences and distinctions, which are ways of relating. And then, so that's the challenge. That's the exercise. That don't project, or if you do project, because it's somewhat inevitable that we would do so, distinguish the projection. Take it and make it distinguish and say, okay, there's a difference between what I think and what may indeed be the case. And that requires practice. That is not trivial. And then so sum that all up and take what is my experience in relating to you, in relating to the other person, and give it back to the other person in a form of words, in a form of language. Gee, Mr. Smith, you really been dealing with something. Gee whiz, Ms. Jones, that was really hard to get through. Holy cow, man, what did you think at that point? What must that have been like to have to survive that? You see the idea. Acknowledge and recognize. Oftentimes, an empathic responsiveness consists in giving the other person back what it is that they have experienced in such a way that they recognize it as their own. The shoemaker's children have no shoes. You're one of the shoemaker's children here. Your boss or your company is busy providing this service for everybody in North America, but it can't provide it for you. Isn't that an interesting problem and an interesting challenge to have? So one, in effect, gives the person back their experience. And the short version of that is recognition and acknowledgement, to recognize and acknowledge what the other person has been dealing with. I pause for breath at that moment. That's 4 aspects of empathy. Receptivity. Who is the other person as a possibility? Take a walk in their shoes and give them that back, the other person back, her or his experience in a form which she or he will recognize it as their own. And at that point they say, man, you got it. I understand you. I have been understood. Now that, or not. And then you get to reiterate. So this is an iterative circular process. If you feel a little dizzy, go with it, be with it. The process is working. So now let's turn to the promise of this webinar. We are at this point in the realm of tips and techniques. Ultimately, empathy, you're going to hear this more than once, is being with the other person without anything else added, without judgments, evaluations, without cynicism, without shaming, without bullying, without resignation. So that's deep. That goes deep, but less deep. So I need something I can use by Friday at 4 p.m. And that's the world of tips and techniques. So we're going to now engage with what I have found to be 7 of the top empathy lessons. Lesson number 1. This is counterintuitive. There's enough empathy to go around. You know how we can feed everybody? So an analogy. I offer an analogy. You know how we can feed everybody on the planet? Thanks to agribusiness and green revolution and miracle seeds, if we pile up all of the food that is produced on the planet Earth, and we make a list of all the people, and in fact, don't pile up all the people, but we can get enough nutrition to everybody so that nobody has to starve or go hungry or go sick or die because of lack of food. And people are starving. People are starving in the Middle East. People are starving in Africa. Hey, people are starving here in Chicago itself. One may ask, what's going on here? Why is that? Why are people starving when there's enough food to go around? Well, the short answer is because of politics in the negative sense, politics in the pejorative sense, because of human aggression, because of human badness, because of bullying, because of shame and guilt and manipulation. Well, so here's the analogy. There's enough empathy to go around. And why does it seem like so many organizations pick up, if you don't pick up the newspaper, go to Google News or turn on your news program of choice, and it seems like we're living in an empathy desert. Well, same idea. Politics of interpersonal relations in the pejorative sense, because of shame, because of bullying, because of aggression. The supply is sufficient, and what we have here is a redistribution program for empathy. And most of the remaining of the empathy lessons are going to be this redistribution program for empathy. So we're going to live into that now. We're going to continue motoring forward. So there's enough empathy to go around. It seems like we're living in a situation of scarcity, but there actually is plenty when we bring it forth. So second empathy lesson, empathy, the world needs more compassion. The world needs more niceness and kindness. I've not found that the world is overflowing with kindness. One of the hazards, one of the risks, one of the dangers, if you will, I would say risk is a good neutral business relevant interpersonal, is compassion fatigue, burnout, empathic distress. Consider this is big in any service orientation. It's a big problem in the corporate transformation of American medicine. The commitment to empathy is strong. The burnout is also pervasive. It's a big issue for first responders, people who commit fire, police, emergency ambulance, military, all kinds of first responders. It turns out a lot of people are first responders for one thing or another. There's a great risk here. And so what's going on here? Consider the possibility that if you're experiencing compassion fatigue, maybe you're being compassionate. Maybe you're being too compassionate. What the heck does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean be hard-hearted. It doesn't mean be mean. It doesn't mean be unkind. It means that empathy and compassion are distinct. And how are they distinct? Well, I'm glad you asked. The next empathy lesson is going to help us get a handle on how they are distinct. Most people, I'm going to go to the mat on this one, a vast majority of people think of empathy as an on-off switch. It's more like a dial. It's more like a tuner, like a rheostat. Dial it up, dial it down. A first responder is going to dial down her or his empathy. Don't be unempathic. Empathy can give us a clue if the other person is going to escalate. Empathy can give us a clue if the other person is going to be enraged and go off the top end. You don't want to turn it off altogether. Rather, you want to dial it down. The physician, the medical doctor dealing with a messy emergency room situation is going to need to dial down her or his empathy. The surgeon has to dial down her or his empathy. If I've got an appendicitis, page the surgeon, and the surgeon's going to relate to my body as a biological system, not necessarily as a human being, but yet as a human being also at a certain level. So don't turn the empathy off, but definitely it has to be dialed down. That's the empathy training. We don't necessarily practice doing that. And guess what? If I meet you and I don't really get who you are or where you're coming from or what you're about, and vice versa, you meet me and you're like, I'm somehow enigmatic, I'm a puzzle for you. Well, that's when I have to dial up the empathy. Be open to whatever feelings I might be getting from the other person. Am I feeling vicarious fear or anger? Do I smell smoke? He or she is doing a slow burn about something. I might want to ask about that. Well, what do you think is going on here? Have the conversation. Dial up the take a walk in the other person's shoes with some understanding of where she or he is coming from. What do I think might be going on over there? And guess what? Have the conversation. Hey, it seems to me that maybe such and so, it didn't work as you had planned, and understandably you're upset about that. And then it all comes out. And finally, I have to take the step of giving back to the other person whatever I got from them. Be responsive. Say, hey, I don't necessarily know, but it just seems to me, or maybe I do know. Put it out there. Make a challenge, issue a challenge. If I'm a person in authority and have the authority and have the listening, lay it down and see how that works. So an important empathy lesson here, having created a context that we don't have to live in an environment of scarcity of empathy. Both compassion and empathy are extremely important, and we need more of them individually and in community both, and they are distinct. Give you another easy example, if I can cross the street to avoid the homeless person, I'm dialing my empathy down. I may not be proud of that, but I can also cross the street and lay a 5 on him and buy that copy of Streetwise. So if I can dial it down, I can also dial it up. Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to now talk more about that and what that looks like. So, those of you who may be hearing this on replay, it's now actually November 29th, 2018. We are in the holiday season. Here's a thought for the holiday season, or frankly, any season. Empathy is never needed more when it seems there's no time for it. Well, what that means is, now this is a powerful tip. You utter this in the presence of the boss, of the team, of the competition, and I pretty much promise you that 99 times out of 100, they will stop and give you a minute and a half to 2 minutes to say whatever it is you have to say. So be ready. This is very practical. And it also, if we get around, oftentimes you'll hear me say things like, well, this is not the truth with a capital T, but consider the possibility. Well, this is one of the things that might actually be the truth with a capital T. You never need empathy more than when it seems there's no time for it. And so it's a tough thing because one has to ruthlessly prioritize, but make some time for empathy. Moving right along, let's have some poetic inspiration. The poet Robert Frost wrote, "Good fences make good neighbors." A fence is distinct from a wall. I just want to put that on the tape. A fence is distinct from a wall, and I'm standing by it. Good fences make good neighbors. I add, there is a gate in the fence, and over the gate is the word empathy. In business, think a service level agreement, think a commitment. The SLA is a commitment. So what does that actually mean? It means that the self is distinct from the other. You and me are two distinct people, a bold statement of the obvious. And the self-other distinction is fundamental and essential to the definition of empathy. I've been reading up on Buddhism, which may be a trend, and in certain versions of Buddhism and even of Hinduism and the veil of Maya and South Asian alternative spiritual disciplines, it is maintained, it is sometimes asserted that the distinction between self and other is an illusion. That I and you are different is really an illusion. And here's the problem with that maybe empathy is an illusion if the self-other distinction is essential to the definition of empathy. We're not really able to go to the penetrate through the veil of Maya at that point. So I want to make that point that, once again, empathy is distinct from compassion. And the distinction, self and other, is essential to the definition of empathy. And where the boundary is very important. We're going to end up doing a lot of work on boundaries as one does empathy training and practice. And so there's a big old gate in the fence, and over the gate is the word empathy. Empathy is about going back and forth between self and other, but yet remaining distinct. You've got your issues, I've got my issues. We can share, we can collaborate or not. Sometimes we agree to disagree. Sometimes we have a productive disagreement. That can be very powerful. Keep that in mind. Moving right along. Here's a phenomenon. Empathy reduces conflict, aggression. Giving somebody a good listening de-escalates anger and rage. The customer comes in, rah, 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 rah. Wow, it sounds like you really had a tough time. Rah, 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 rah. Wow, what's going on here? How may I, it turns out the product didn't function as designed. It turned out there was a feature. It was not a bug. It was a feature. Pretty soon, the customer starts to de-escalate, and I'm able to actually get a word in edgewise and look and see what's the problem. It might be easy to fix. It might be more difficult to fix. It might be a level 2 issue. I might have to make a request. I might have to. Nevertheless, when you find that people are angry and rage, and it does seem to be a growth industry these days, if you look at the news, this is really distressing. They have experienced a dignity violation of some sort. They haven't gotten the dignity, the respect, in some sense, empathy that they feel they are entitled to. Now, we can debate whether their perception is accurate, whether their perception is inaccurate, but simply from a business point of view, simply from a point of view of the corporate transformation of American medicine and giving the informed consumer of healthcare services that to which they are entitled, it behooves us to err on the side of assumption that I didn't necessarily perpetrate the dignity violation, but the person is experiencing some kind of an issue there. And I might want to have to dig into that and actually raise the issue in an empathic way. It seems to me that you've experienced some kind of a disappointment. Can you say more about that? What's going on here? How can we make a difference? You get the point. You see where this is going. This one you can take to the bank, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, this has happened time after time. Somebody's angry, enraged, give them a little empathy. I'm telling you, it goes a long way. It can make a profound difference. Now, it doesn't always solve the problem, but it does create an opening for a resolution in terms of what they're actually requesting, what's actually going on. It's a form of research. And so ultimately, the difference between compassion and empathy is a method of data gathering about the experience of the other person. I sample your experience. You sample my experience. You get a trace of what it is that I'm feeling. So empathy tells me what the other person is experiencing, my good ethics, my morality, my compassion, my good upbringing tell me what to do about it. So the two are distinct. And so in that sense, it can cut both ways. The bad guys can use empathy. Red team, good guys, bad guys. Nevertheless, fundamentally, given a positive frame of mind and a commitment to community and to humanity, empathy is a method of gathering data, which is at the experiential level. You actually get a vicarious experience of another person's experience. And then that gets further processed. If you stop there, you get emotional contagion. You have to process that information, that data, if you will, further by who is this person as a possibility, by asking, how can I take a walk in their shoes such that I can get a sense of what the other person is dealing with, and then be responsive empathically, acknowledge the challenge, and then go to work with the other person about how to address the issue, solve the problem. I pause for breath at this point. And so here is the 1-minute empathy training. I can actually train you in empathy in 1 minute. And we'll also do an exercise not included in the 1 minute. And then the work begins. Practice, practice, practice. A bold statement of the obvious, it's going to take more than 1 minute to expand your empathy. But you can start in 1 minute. And so here's the training. Drive out cynicism, drive out denial, drive out shame, guilt, judgment, opinion, assessment, drive out aggression, drive out bullying, drive out politics in the pejorative sense. Then empathy naturally and spontaneously comes forth. Human beings are naturally empathic. It's true, we're also naturally aggressive. But in this instance, we're emphasizing and empathizing with the empathy. People lack practice in empathy. Practice it, you get better at it. But that's not the point here. The point is that when we drive out shame, cynicism, resignation, empathy naturally comes forth. Now notice here's the kicker from a business point of view. You spend any time in the business world, you will see that cynicism and resignation are pervasive. It's really a challenge. You have to distinguish those. I'm not even saying stop being that. You're going to be cynical. What I'm saying is you're going to then distinguish it and say, that's not who I am as a possibility. I'm a possibility as commitment to this is a great product. I'm a possibility of commitment to this is a great service. I'm a possibility of the commitment this is a great business and I believe in it and committed to it. Or I'm updating my resume, which is maybe an empathic gesture as well. Or I'm committed to my family and there's nothing wrong with the business. I'm going to do what I need to do. I'm going to satisfy the service level agreement. And we're going to have a great family life and the kids are going to go to college and I'm going to have a vacation and so on. All of this. So that is actually the 1 minute empathy training. You see how it's a little bit, you have to kind of back into it. We've covered 7 tips and techniques which are the straight on attack. And here's the sort of, if this were chess, I would say en passant, in passing. kind of crossing over and kind of with a good backhanded swat for those of you who know anything about tennis. And so ultimately, drive out cynicism, shame, bullying, denial by setting limits. One has to set a limit. In terms of the tips and techniques, somebody uses devaluing language. I'm really concerned about that language. How to set a limit to bully. So that we need to do a separate seminar on that. And how ultimately empathy is, well, we'll talk more about how it's the ultimate capitalist tool, but that it is. And so in the final analysis, empathy is being present in the presence of another person without anything else added, so that I'm able to come in effect from nothing. So we now have a second polling question, which Rachel will queue up, and you will see what that is momentarily. And here it is: obstacles to expanding my empathy. And I'm going to say what that is. What are your obstacles to expanding your empathy? Think about it. I hear this a lot. I'm a natural empath. I feel the pain and suffering too deeply. I'm a natural empath. I feel too deeply the pain and suffering, and it stops me. The boss is a bully. That's an obstacle to my empathy. I work in an empathy desert. Heard that one. Listening for agreement, not for possibility. That happens. Lack of respect for boundaries in my environment. So there may be others. That's not the full load, but here we have some polling results, and I'm going to comment briefly on that. Listening for agreement is a surprisingly strong obstacle. I would agree with that. So, pardon me, maybe I need to disagree with it in order to create the possibility of a productive disagreement. Nevertheless, when there's agreement, it becomes why? Why is that an issue? Why is listening for agreement, not for possibility, an issue? Because it lands as being fake. That's at least one of the issues. And so listening for possibility, listening out of the box, that's a cliche, but I think an appropriate one in this case. What is really, instead of listening for agreement, listening for what's possible here. And that's where you drive out cynicism and resignation. This is very powerful in any environment, whether it's a corporate environment, an academic environment. You get a lot of agreement in the corporate environment too. In the academic environment too, there's a lot of agreement. Sometimes a productive disagreement can be very powerful. 9% of people comp to working in an empathy desert. 14% of people say the boss is a bully. Wow, that's a significant percentage. We got about 27%, a little under a third, comp to being a natural empath. I'm tempted to say I feel your pain at that point, except that it would land as being a little bit fake. Rather, I give some constructive guidance. I speak the truth here, and I also give some constructive guidance. This is where you may usefully practice tuning empathy up and tuning it down. Most people are not in touch with their feelings and may usefully tune their empathy up. I think that is a oversimplification, but a useful oversimplification. Most people are not in touch with their feelings and may usefully tune their empathy up, be more in touch with feelings. But about a little under a third of people assert, I believe, credibly and straightforwardly and honestly, to being natural empaths. I just feel the pain and suffering of the world too deeply, and it stops my empathy. I can't do it. I then turn it off. Well, the guidance is don't turn it off. Turn it down. Turn it down to protect yourself. Get some distance. Maybe you need to cross the street this one time. On another time, you may be open to the possibility of crossing the street in the direction of dealing with the tough issue that needs to be dealt with. Clean up what needs to be cleaned up. That's quick guidance there. And you need to practice, right? Practice, practice, practice. Easier said than done, but there's no other way around it, and make mistakes and get better at it and say, well, this time I didn't get better. I got worse at it. This is going, I need to re-engage with my commitment. And what the promise then is, you're going to gain expanded freedom of action. You're going to gain expanded possibilities for self-expression. And so let's turn to an exercise. This should take couple of minutes, not very long. This is a really short exercise. I'm going to speak in the first person to induce empathy. And you want to take my first person speech and apply it to yourself. So I'm walking down the street. So here's the dilemma I have. My commitment to empathy is strong. I'm listening to you. Tell me about your issue, your problem. Tell me about your day. Tell me about your boss. Tell me about your webinar. Tell me about your life. And I'm not listening to you. I'm listening to my opinion of what you're saying instead of what you're saying. You see the problem. Now, I've been working on this for a while. And maybe you have been too, in which case I acknowledge your commitment to empathy. And notice there's a difference. So you now get to apply this to yourself. I'm having a conversation with myself about what I'm hearing from you. And I'm having an opinion, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether I agree. Notice the agreement point, whether I disagree, whether I heard it before. I already know that. I don't know that. This is new. You hear the conversation here? So the exercise. So we're going to distinguish the two. I'm going to stop and pause for maybe a full 10 seconds and let you listen to the conversation you are having. As you listen to me, to this webinar, or to whatever you're listening to. I make no assumptions about what you're listening to. So I'm going to pause and let you listen to your own conversation, what you're having with yourself. Ready, set, go. $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. Ding. Exercise is open. Exercise is done. So what did you hear? Okay. You heard, what is this guy talking about? Well, that's the conversation. You heard, what voice? Well, that's the voice. You heard, this guy is really full of it, or this guy is really da-da-da, or this guy is really great, or something good, the good, the bad. You heard the good, the bad, and the in-between. Well, that's the conversation. And so here's the value of the exercise. Distinguish that opinion, assessment, judgment, distinguish that conversation that I and or you are having with oneself, and then set that aside. It's not like you can actually stop having the conversation. I'm not telling you to stop having the conversation. I'm telling you to distinguish it. Why am I telling you not to stop it? Because I don't think you can. Most people have a lot of trouble, and then your energy gets wasted trying to stop something that you really mostly can't stop. And so just set it aside and listen to what the other person is saying. And so I must say, I hope and I believe you will find this exercise to be of use to you. And at this point, we're going to bring it in for a landing here, so we have sufficient time to mix it up and have a back and forth. I'm very interested in your questions, comments, interventions. So you'll be thinking about some of that and multitasking. So here are some additional things to think about in terms of our conclusions. When I meet with executives or chairmen or women or persons of departments and organizations or directors or vice presidents, and I ask them, what's your budget for empathy training? I usually get a blank stare or no, none. But when I ask them, what's your budget for improved teamwork, for promoting innovation, for expanding productivity, for getting beyond agreement to possibility, then it turns out there's a significant interest and even budget for the training, for the work. So keep that in mind. The word is important, but the word itself, the word empathy, it has its uses, but it's not essential. What is essential is being open, being with people, being coming from who is this person I don't necessarily know, and who are they as a possibility? And if I get stuck, take a walk in their shoes, and being responsive in a way that creates possibility. So, from the point of view of leadership, when people feel gotten for who they are as a possibility, then the person commits. They expand their relationship with the organization. The individual stops withholding, stops being stingy, uh, says the out of the box thing that might really make a difference and help build the team. So it creates an environment where people stop withholding and bring forth, and actually it can be fun. It can actually, create in a positive sense of the word. So that's a couple of more thoughts on what is empathic leadership. A bold statement of the obvious: empathic leaders lead from contribution and commitment, not fear. Why don't you need to lead from fear? Well, it's quite simple. People are already afraid. You don't have to add, think about it, this is not funny, right? But just a chuckle of acknowledgement and recognition at this point. People are already afraid enough. And if one can dial down the fear, then innovation, productivity, contribution come forth. And identifying, complex organizations, we're living in a world of complexity. Yes, by all means, for example, yes, by all means, follow the money, but don't follow it off a cliff. Enough said. If there are integrity outages, so what is integrity? Integrity is being whole and complete and functioning as designed. I don't really mean this word in an ethical, moral sense. I don't mean be immoral either. Of course, that's not, don't lie or cheat, of course. One is assumed to have, but be whole and complete, and things function as designed. A bicycle wheel has integrity. When it's round, the spokes are all in place. If it were square, that's a bicycle wheel that is lacking in integrity. Why? Because it's not going to work. So if there are integrity outages, if somebody gave their word to deliver on a certain date and the deliverable is not there, then this is what the cleanup looks like. I said it, the deliverable will be ready on November 29th at noon. We're now not going to make the deadline. And when we are going to make the deadline, well, then you clean it up and you renew the commitment and say what is going to be possible to do. And so that's also an essential aspect. The integrity is around honoring one's word. And empathic leaders also working with people, applying these tips and techniques and a deep understanding of who people are as a possibility, then finds a person who is well suited, even optimally suited for the job, and surrounds her or himself with the best people possible. Thus, key term here, creating a setup for success. Go into the meeting and ask, what's really going to create a setup for success here? You get stuck, ask, what's going to create a setup for success here? And so at this point, I express my thanks for your gracious and generous listening. I express my thanks for your empathy. I've really been honored to be able to engage here, and I look forward to hearing your questions, comments, issues. What are your questions?
The first question that I'll give to you from the audience, Lou, is someone says, I have to do performance evaluations of my staff. And I'm listening to your presentation. I do know I want to hear their position, but it feels a little counterintuitive to empathy. So how might you give me advice to this person on how to use empathy, but also be able to perform performance evaluations?
So let me make sure I get the question as you were breaking up there. We dropped a couple of packets, I'm sorry to say. The question is, I have to do performance evaluations for my staff. And it seems counterintuitive to bring empathy to that. How do I both do performance evaluations and do so in an empathic way? I think that's how I understand the question. If it's different than that, you tell me. Okay, that's it. Well, so define our terms. My understanding of performance evaluation is now here's the rub. The person has agreed to certain performance standards, parameters. Sometimes there's data. I've been known to say things like, we don't need more data, we need expanded empathy, but in truth, we need both. So what you want to say is that here are the numbers, here is your performance. What is going to create, I mean, congratulations, you get da 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 or da da da. Or, I mean, I'm assuming, don't make any assumptions, Lou. There's at least three scenarios. The individual has performed above average. Congratulations. Hey, I mean, that's relatively easy and straightforward. Who you are as a possibility is a great success in this organization. But oftentimes performance is like there's room, shall we say, there's room for improvement in a certain area. And so the empathic leader says, what do you think we should do to cause an adjustment in the direction of our goals going forward? You begin by soliciting the input of the other person. And you might want to do so before the meeting, right? I mean, you're not going to expect necessarily, or you might want to allow 28 or 48 hours for follow-up, right? I mean, so, there's going to be a conversation here. And you solicit the other, and that would be empathic. Solicit the other person's input to how the performance can be adjusted. But that could also be, how do we really knock the top off of it? We're going to improve by 10%. Well, why stop at 10? Why don't we go for 25? Maybe there's some ideas that would do that. So that's that's what I see straight out of the box. I invite the other person's contribution to how we're going to make the adjustments, and then we iterate that. I'm hoping that they have something to say or something to think about that. You want to follow up? That's okay too.
Can you give an example of an empathetic leader, and can you share how rare are empathetic leaders?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the high end, Barack Obama, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi. I can give many examples of empathic teachers at the University of Chicago. David, he's not actually a professor, but he's now at the Institute for Politics, David Axelrod. You listen to that guy, you get empathy. And he's doing great work having conversations with Republicans, by the way. I mean, he's the architect of the Obama victory. He's having some interesting empathic conversations. So listen to his podcast. Let's see. So what was the second part of the question? So there's some examples there. Now that's setting the bar pretty high,
How rare are empathetic leaders?
Yeah, well, that would make a great research project. My sense is the world is not overflowing with empathy, right? It is rare. It is rare. I'm going to go with the 80-20 rule. I would say, and that's good news, because if we have 20% of the leaders have got some significant empathic chops, have got, are contenders in the matter of empathy, then, and the rest of them are not unempathic. It's not like they're all bullies, 20% are on the empathic, getting some traction, 20% are bullies, and 60% are in the middle and surviving their leadership role, right? They're like trying to manage risks and stay out of trouble and playing small. And it's not inspiring, but it's not as such unempathic. It's just kind of boring. That's my take on the numbers. Let's see. I'm thinking whether, the problem is you need examples of somebody you could relate to, right? Because, I could mention a bunch of people that I know who I think are pretty empathic, but you might never heard of them. But okay, so there are some examples there.
Can you share any tips for improving empathy throughout an organization? Is a trickle-down effect from the top most effective? Should we identify empathetic leaders already in the organization and encourage them to share their abilities with others?
Right, brilliant. I like that one, because you begin by asking, well, what's the setup for success here? Our commitment, let's say our commitment is to expanding empathy in the organization for so many reasons. Well, it's going to be both top down and bottom up. I mean, leadership is leadership. If you're going to read the Harvard Business Review, and it's always going to say it starts at the top. It stops at the top, but it also starts at the top. I speak the truth. And if the leader of the organization says, comes out and say, well, we're going to be a commitment to expanding empathy, and here's what we mean by it. There are now human resources organizations, Business Solver, Data Dimensions, Right Management, Manpower. I mean, empathy is a growth industry in human resources. Now, do they get it right? I mean, yeah, well, I mean, the intention is good. So you want a program, I should say, well, we've got one. We may need to talk in more detail about this. There's an opening here. But in terms of tips and techniques, here's the thing that's going to happen. As soon as I stand up and say, I'm a commitment to empathy, people will challenge it. Get ready. So one has to do one's homework up front. One has to clean up one's act. One has to restore any integrity outages. This is the critical path to succeeding with empathy. If one has been unempathic, if one has been a bully, if one has made mistakes, clean them up, acknowledge, take responsibility, and state the commitment. That, I mean, in business, it's a lot about service level agreements. One wants to look at because that's one's commitment, and honoring one's word. I mean, then there are breakdowns. The breakdowns are going to be against the service. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong. It means there's a breakdown and there's work to be done. That's business, right? I mean, I mean, we can speculate about the nightmares that are happening at certain large technology companies from time to time, but that's another story. And so I'm kind of riffing on this one because it's such a rich question. One does want to start with one-to-one coaching because one has to define one's terms. What do I gave you a definition there. Most people aren't using that definition. It'll keep you out of a lot of trouble. You go with that definition there. You take it to the organization. It's gonna help you manage the risks, right? The risks are compassion fatigue, burnout, and so you're gonna practice dialing it up and dialing it down and keeping one's word. That's the short how to do it coaching. Thank you.
Lou, could you say a little bit more about what's the case for increasing empathy from a business perspective? Maybe some results you've seen from organizations you've worked with?
Yes, the business case for increasing empathy. Well, the short version, remember I was saying, you ask what's the budget for empathy training and it's zero, but what's the budget for improved teamwork? What's the budget for expanded productivity? What's the budget for expanded customer satisfaction? What's the budget for expanded employee satisfaction? All of these things, one can indeed bring some kind of a metric to them. That's what the business case looks like. If you have to ask, what's the business case for empathy? In a certain sense, I'm just going to be bold and difficult at this point. Don't quote me out of context, but if you have to ask, what's the case for empathy? You just don't get it. Empathy is what makes us human beings. So it's what's the business case for being a human being? You're not interested? Okay, so go to the defense industry. Our job is to blow you up. Well, we'll blow you up more empathically. It could be a little problematic here. But in any other scenario where we're providing a service to human beings, to citizens, to the public, the business case looks like expanded productivity, enhanced commitment on the part of the staff to the success of the organization. These are hard to quantify, but by no means impossible. One has to set a metric where one is at today, look at adjustments that can be made, and start having the conversation. Empathy lives in the conversation. So that would be the short recommendation right up front.
Lou, how do you measure empathy enterprise-wide?
This is great. This is a challenging question, all right? Belinda is out there, and she has, I'm blanking on, she's a colleague, and she actually has an empathy assessment enterprise-wide. This is going to be shameless self-promotion on my part here, but I'm blanking on her last name. This is really inexcusable. I can follow up on this one. But she's got like, where do you as an enterprise stand on some kind of a measure? She's got a measure of it, and she looks at social responsibility. She looks at how does your enterprise show up in terms of tweets and on social networking. This was before the fake news thing kind of exploded some of that. She looks at an internal survey of how the employees assess the executives. I think it's a fascinating thing. And she interviews a lot of tech companies, Nestle didn't actually get on her list, at least as of a year ago, which is, I don't understand why that is the case, but it's just that there's so many companies and one has to draw the limit somewhere. So, this is what we would call a beauty contest. There's nothing wrong with beauty contests. I think one can learn something useful and interesting in terms of the conversation, but I would issue a word of caution about enterprise-wide empathy prizes, if you will. That's my answer.
Lou, the final question I'll ask you, and I know we have some questions we didn't get to answer, and we'll be sending out an email with this video to everyone, and we'll also have Lou's contact information if you would like to contact him directly with those questions. The final question is just, in one sentence, what would be the key takeaway of your webinar today?
When all is said and done, when all the arguments, the data, the distinctions, the round and round, the hermeneutic circle, the positive and pejorative politics are set aside, empathy is quite simply being in the presence of another human being.
Thank you. Thank you everyone who attended, and a special thank you to Lou for sharing with us the importance of empathy and giving us ways that we can flex that muscle to improve our own leadership and our relationships with those that we work with and encounter every day. This is the end of our Career Month. If you missed any of our webinars, you can check them out on our YouTube channel, University of Chicago Alumni Career Programs. And if I would invite you all to come back in December. We're having a webinar on fear and frustration in the workplace on December 4th that I think could be interesting. Take care and have a great rest of your day.